So this image here is of that camp, which you can see is a very desolate landscape. And those kind of concrete pads are the foundations of barracks that once existed there. But because it's the recent past, you also want to incorporate oral histories. So this was my first experience of speaking with people who had survived an episode of displacement, but talking to them specifically about material culture and how they made a really difficult situation livable. So this man that I'm talking to here, his name was Bill, and he was actually incarcerated in one of these barracks as a child at this site. Unfortunately, he's now passed away. But this is the first time I kind of got a taste of how you could intertwine oral history information, systematic survey of material landscapes, and come up with a really archaeological question about how those things are related. As a graduate student, I wanted to focus on more and more recent pasts. And theoretically, I got into what was a very emergent subfield of contemporary archaeology. Contemporary archaeology looks at landscapes that are still in use and still being changed. So material ramifications of modern day problems like warfare, homelessness, neoliberal development, forced migration. And I really took inspiration from a lot of these scholars mentioned on the slide who were really at the forefront of developing this very new field. Yeah, so that's what contemporary archaeology is.
You were studying in a very different context in your undergrad years. So how did you, initially become interested in partition histories?
Yeah, I was actually at the same time that I was working on excavations of these Japanese incarceration camps, I also got involved as a Berkeley undergraduate student with the 1947 Partition Archive. I had an internship and I was an archivist, but I also started volunteering as a citizen oral historian and interviewing people who had migrated but eventually resettled in the United States. So people both in California, and then once I started graduate school in New York, people in New York City as well. And I really hadn't heard much about partition histories before this. But through this experience of talking to people who had survived this event, I became really interested in the material aspects of those stories. So what do you do after relocating and almost always coming with almost nothing to create a livable home once again? And how do you interact with especially urban spaces that had been very shaped by people who out-migrated? So often people who were incoming were interacting with spaces like evacuee properties that had been vacated by those moving in the opposite direction. And I just felt like there was a really interesting archaeological question there.
So can you talk in a little bit detail that where did all these partition refugees who were coming to Delhi, where did they resettle?
Absolutely. And I want to say first that one of the strengths of something like the 1947 Partition Archive is that it demonstrates to us how singular each partition experience is, right? So scholars like me, we try to characterize and see patterns, but you have to take that with a grain of salt, and you have to realize that everyone's partition experience was unique. So what I'm saying here about Delhi and very broad patterns doesn't accurately characterize every partition experience by any means, just as a disclaimer. But one thing that I'll say is that Delhi was a place where many, many partition refugees settled. Estimates of how many people were displaced by the partition vary widely, but some of the highest go up to 17 million. And 500,000 of those actually landed in Delhi itself, in the capital. So a good chunk of those landed in Delhi. When we think about those experiences, we typically think about camps like this one. This was an image that appeared in Life magazine. And these are of temporary relief camps. So places of real precarity. Now, what I was focusing on were not these impermanent ephemeral kind of spaces where people first sought shelter, I was thinking about where people ended up more permanently. And the two types of spaces in Delhi that were most important in this regard were evacuee properties, which I've kind of already defined before, those spaces vacated by Muslims who had either outmigrated or been internally displaced within India, and also government-built refugee colonies. And refugees very commonly ended up in other types of housing and spaces, but the vast majority ended up in one of these two types of housing long term. The evacuee properties fall within what was Delhi's pre-partition urban footprint, which is the orange area here on this map. The government-built colonies really made up a lot of the new urban space. So after partition, Delhi's urban footprint almost doubled, as you can see by this map. And a lot of those government-built refugee colonies filled in this new area, this green space on this map. So as an archaeologist, I was trying to systematically sample these types of spaces by drawing floor plans of houses, taking photographs, but also interviewing families. And I really tried to visit every single partition government-built colony and every area that had a lot of evacuee properties. But then in terms of other types of housing, like employee colonies or cooperative housing societies, I wasn't as exhaustive in my sampling. I kind of tried to look at select stories, but not every single type of place. So altogether, I visited 73 different locations in the field, spending an average of 2 days at each site.
So, how do you think, Professor Riggs, that the Delhi's built landscape was changed due to this influx of refugees and resettlement through refugee colonies? What was the effect on Delhi?
Yeah, let's look at just a few select examples. First, what were kind of the typical trends of how evacuee properties changed? Very often, what had been single family but extended family homes, often kind of Haveli style homes built around a courtyard, like you see in this floor plan here, after the partition were subdivided between many refugee families. And what this has caused through time is a lot of congestion as different portions of that family have tried to commercialize those spaces and make use out of the space they were given, which really wasn't enough, right? So in this case, we see that this single family extended home is now been developed into half of it is a modern day hotel. The other half is kind of a layering of different shop spaces, abandoned portions that used to be residential and now aren't really used to that extent. And in a lot of evacuee property areas in Delhi, even those that had been very wealthy residential areas before the partition, very commonly you see this type of trajectory of built landscapes. Very oppositely, government-built colonies have become really high-value property areas. And in my research, I really argue that the government's design was quite effective in this regard, which is an interesting and kind of rare, unique example of a central authority trying to help a community in need, and doing so in a way that was productive, at least in my opinion. A lot of the colonies initially looked like this. They were very small, kind of modest housing units with 2 or 3 multi-purpose rooms, usually a kitchen, washroom, and latrine kind of extending out in a row in the back. But they were designed with a lot of open space around these units with the intention that families would build on and change them through time. And that's kind of the important, unique aspect of this type of housing. I will say that designs kind of changed through time as the government became more frantic. So as I surveyed these areas, a lot of the earlier government colonies, like Lajpatnagar, had larger housing units. So it's really hard to see what the original housing units looked like today when you're in the field, because almost all of them have been radically changed, right? But these are some of the very few examples of those that haven't been changed. So here is what was a very typical 100 square yard plot home, a shop cum residence space, and a 200 square yard plot home. Now, as the government started to realize, hey, we're not producing homes fast enough and people are still coming in, they started to build a little bit smaller units, even though that isn't what they wanted. That wasn't the ideal they were striving for. So an example of this type of slightly later built colony is Modi Nagar. And here you see some really large multi-unit complexes with as many as 32 or 64 families living in the same building. And these are really distinctive even from Google satellite imagery. You can really pick out the square or kind of figure 8 shape of these buildings from Google satellite. And also 4-unit complexes where there would be 2 families on the upper story and 2 families on the lower story of the same building. Now, in these government colonies, they were quite easy to develop through time. So here's kind of a very typical way that a 100 square yard unit would be developed through time. Manjeet is a pseudonym I'm using here because my research deals with people's homes and images of their homes. I include no names or addresses, and all of that has kind of been hidden for privacy reasons. But with this particular family, they built on very quickly through time, often adding flats to accommodate, like when their son got married, for example, or when they wanted to have a business development, when they acquired a little bit more stability financially. So what you see in these kind of spaces is what was a very rudimentary government-provided home that becomes a very high value type of residence eventually. The 200 square yard plots, this is even more the case. This is in Nizamuddin. These 3 houses were developed by 3 brothers, all who received a different 200 square yard unit that was initially identical. And you can see that today, each has kind of developed that home to a different extent, adding a different number of floors, but it's become a really prized area that people describe as being a space that they really love and a space that they see themselves as having created, right? This isn't a space where they got aid. This is a space where they were given something very basic and turned it into something amazing, right?
So, Dr. Riggs, like when I have talked to the interviewees, partition survivors, almost, most of them say that they lived in these very large havelis with big courtyards, and when they had to come here, they were provided, these very little spaces like 100-yard houses, 200-yard houses, and since you were able to record their experiences as well, oral accounts, so did they tell, what did they feel about, coming from such a big house and having to accommodate to these smaller places?
Almost everyone I spoke with definitely expressed great loss, often nostalgia, even often if they very much like the house that they've now developed through time. There's still a wish to see previous homes. There's still this kind of longing to think back about how life used to be before partition. But I think it's important when we talk about partition histories to not only focus on loss and hardship, but also think about, how we might take lessons of partition and think about effective responses to refugee crises or displacement in the modern day world. And actually, there is a lot of hopefulness, at least in the case of some efforts to resettle refugees in Delhi after the partition.
And what can we learn more broadly about modern era displacements from this case study of Delhi?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this is a really, unique and rare example of a displaced community that arrived in mass in huge numbers with almost nothing that has been really successful. This isn't the best image. I'm working on updating it for my current book. But the refugee colony locations here are the black dots, and the background map shows property values. And the more red the area, the higher the property value. So here you can kind of quantitatively see that there is a connection between where refugee colonies are located and what is really central now, today, as Delhi's expanded, and really high value residential areas in the city. And this is an important lesson because in the modern world, displaced communities are pathologized. They're viewed as a threat to host communities. And here's an example where a refugee community did not remain dependent on aid, did not ask continuously for help from the government. In fact, they are now a celebrated part of Delhi's history and what is seen as having positively developed the city. It's also beyond just thinking about displacement. It helps us think about how central authorities plan housing for those in need more broadly. And again, it's a really rare example. So other archaeologists have looked at things like council housing in the UK, or even Soviet apartment design in Russia. And very commonly, the conclusion is that these areas through time have become spaces that people don't really want to live in. They are small. Forms of alteration have been restricted, so people can't really personalize the space very much. And because of that, they've remained low value areas. They haven't gained in value, and often they aren't maintained to a great extent. And again, in this example of Delhi, you see when you give autonomy to people, when you give them a stock in developing their surroundings and freedom to kind of use it in ways that they see as being fit, it can be really productive for not only the families, but the community more broadly. And my conclusions of this particular project are really that. What was unique about this type of housing? And those things are really that residents were given autonomy, that the design was scalable, and that there was a lot of flexibility of use in these spaces.
So Dr. Riggs, that was, your perspective provides a very fresh approach to study of partition. Thank you for joining us here today. Those who are watching, this is 75 Days of Partition, which started on 3rd June and it will go on till 17th of August. We are doing an event every day except Sundays. And please join us at daily at 8 p.m. Pakistan time, 8:30 p.m. Indian time, 9 p.m. Dhaka, and 8 a.m. California. Stay tuned for more. Thank you so much.
Thank you.